Okay, so chord inversions for 7th chords. In my last video, it was called chord inversions, and I just did chord inversions for triads. So I taught that if you have a triad, you can have a root position triad, you can have a first inversion triad, and you can also have a second inversion triad. But now things get a little different here when we're dealing with 7th chords because you have that extra note on the end. Okay, so since you have that extra note on the end, now you're able to make one more inversion. So in 7th chords, we have a root position 7th chord. We have a first inversion 7th chord, a second inversion 7th chord, and also a third inversion 7th chord. So you might have noticed things are already a little different here, and that will be explained in this video. Okay, so let's first do a quick refreshment on chords. So a triad, we have a 1, 3, and a 5. A 7th chord, we have that extra 7th on top, so we have that 1, 3, 5, and 7. Okay, and that is consisted of all thirds. So you start on this first note, you build a third to this next note. From this next note, you build a third to the next note. From that note, you build a third to the next note. And as you can see over here, I drew that. So between C and E, we have a third. Between E and G, we have a third. And between G and B, we have a third. This table up here is going to help you understand what is going on throughout this video. So as you can see here are intervals when stacked. So when I stack that chord, you can see that I have a 1, 3, 5, and 7 because it's all in relationship to this root note. So you have your 1 here. From your 1, you have a 3. From your 1, now you have a 5. And from your 1, now you have a 7. It's good just to understand this. Over here, as you can see, I have the notes in the chords. So our root position chord is C, E, G, B. You read it from the bottom up. As I just went over, it's all thirds. And then here is figured bass, which I'm going to go over more towards the end. And then here's a little table just to kind of walk you through what's going on. So in root position, we had our C, E, G, B, a 1, 3, 7, and 5, and you can see that we just skipped that note in the middle of each of those notes to create that. So this table is going to show you in caps the notes that are in the chord with numbers above it, and then in lowercase there's going to be no numbers above it, and those are going to be the notes that are in the middle of the chord that you're not playing. So those notes are not in the chord, but they're the notes that are in between the chord notes. Okay, before we actually get into the first, second, and third inversion, let's think about one important thing here. And that's that when you build a 1, 3, 5, and 7, when you build that 7, look at your next note. Your next note is a C. So here I'm building a C major 7. So I'm starting on the note C. My last note is B. But if you just go one note up from that B, now I have a C, which is the exact note that I'm starting on. Okay, so now let's get into first inversion. So if we have that root position 7th chord, 1, 3, 5, and 7, we're going to take that 1 and we're going to move it on top of the chord. Okay, so right now it's at the bottom of the chord. Now we're going to move it to the top of the chord, right there. So one more time, I take that 1, I took that first note, that C, I just remove it, and I put it at the end of the chord, or on top of the chord. So there's my first inversion, C major 7 chord. And if you remember inversions for triads, you can see that things are already a little different here because we have that B and that C at the end, which creates a second. Okay, so let's kind of analyze that. So instead of a 1, 3, 5, and 7, now because those last two notes are right next to each other, now I have a 1, 3, 5, and 6. Because as you can see, between my E and my G, there's a third. Between my G and my B, there's also another third. Then between my B and my C, there's only a second. Okay, so we have 1, 3, 5, 6, root, a third above that, a third above that, and then a second above that. Okay, now let's go back to the root position 7th chord. So now from here, if I want to build a second inversion 7th chord, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my 1 and my 3, or in other words, my first two notes of the chord, and now I'm going to put both of those notes in the same order on top of the chord or at the end of the chord. On top of the chord or end of the chord is the same thing, just kind of a different way of looking at it. Okay, so I have C, E, G, B, and I'm taking C, E, and I'm going to put that on top of G and B. So now I have G, B, C, E. That is my second inversion C major 7 chord. And as you can see, now my second is in the middle. Okay, so let's analyze this. From G to B, I still have a third in the middle of that, but then just going from B to C, and I mean, you can count on your fingers, A, B, C. There's only two in between that, B and C. So there we have a second, and then from C to E, we have a third. So that means this chord, instead of being a 1, 3, 5, 7, is a 1, 3, 4, and 6. And remember, all those notes that are in the middle of the chord are down here, just to kind of help you understand this. Okay, so now back to the root position 7th chord. Now if I want to do a third inversion, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these first 3 notes, or in other words, my 1, 3, and my 5, and I'm going to put all those on top of my 7. So I have C, E, G, and then B, and I'm going to take that C, E, G, and I'm going to put that on top of my B. So now with third inversion, my second is there on the very bottom of it. So if we analyze this, between B and C, I have a second. Between C and E, I have a third. And between E and G, I have another third. So because it starts with that second right away, instead of having a 1, 3, 5, 7, you have a 1, 2, 4, 6. And you can see that there on the piano. It's a 1, 2, and then it goes up a third, and then it goes up another third. So as you can see, when you invert 7th chords, things are quite different, especially because you have that additional 7th note, and on top of that, that 7th note is only 1 note away from your root note on your original root position 7th chord. So now you're having to deal with all these second intervals in the chord, instead of like intervals for triads where you're just dealing with fourths instead of thirds. So when you compare that, when you have fourths in your chord, that's going to be more consonant than if you have seconds in your chord. So with inversions for 7th chords, we start to deal with some more dissonant intervals here inside of the chord, which can allow us to create some interesting musical suspense and also give us some interesting options when doing chord voicings. Okay, so now just to kind of conclude everything before I move on to figured bass. So if we have a root position C major 7 chord, I'm going to start on C, I'm going to go up a third, go up another third, and go up another third. In other words, I have a 1, 3, 5, and 7. To do a first inversion 7th chord, all I'm going to do is I'm going to take that first note, that 1, and I'm going to put it on top of the rest of the chord. So now instead of having C, E, G, B, now I have E, G, B, C. And instead of having a 1, 3, 5, 7, now I have a 1, 3, 5, and 6. Then back to my root position 7th chord. Now if I want to build a second inversion from here, I'm going to take my first 2 notes, my 1 and my 3, and I'm going to put that on top of the chord. So now instead of C, E, G, B, now I have G, B, C, E. And instead of like in my root position having a 1, 3, 5, and 7, now I have a 1, 3, 4, and 6. Back to the root position 7th chord. Now if I want to build a third inversion 7th chord, I'm going to take these first 3 notes, or my 1, 3, and my 5, and I'm going to put all those on top of the chord. So now instead of having C, E, G, and B, I have B, C, E, and G. Okay, now just to quickly show you that visually in case that didn't click. So in root position, you have C, E, G, B. And if you want first inversion, all you're going to do is you're going to take this C note and you're going to put that on top of the chord. Then if you're in root position, you want a second inversion, all you're going to do is take your 1 and your 3, or your first 2 notes of the chord in the same order, and you're going to place those on top of the chord. And now if you want a third inversion 7th chord from this root position, all you do is you take the first 3 notes of the chord, or the 1, 3, and the 5 in the same order, and you put those on top of the chord. So all we're doing is we're taking the notes from the bottom and we're putting them on the top, and depending on what inversion we're doing tells us if we're going to be just taking 1 of those notes, 2 of those notes, or 3 of those notes. Okay, so now figured bass for 7th chords. I'm just going to show you how to notate it and to read for figured bass and how to make sense of it. So my chord inversions video, which was chord inversions for triads, I showed you the figured bass for the first and second inversion triads. And I also showed you that the root position triad is not labeled in figured bass. So if it's not labeled, you know it's a root position triad. So to kind of just refresh that, a first inversion triad would be labeled with a 6 below it, and a second inversion triad would be labeled with a 4 and a 6 below it. Okay, so now we already know that we can't notate a blank, a 6, or a 4/6 if we're doing anything with 7th chords, because those are already taken for the triads. So now we're going to have to come up with some different notations to describe 7th chord figured bass, and this all makes sense and it has to do with the intervals in the chord, so let's get into it. First of all, a root position 7th chord will just be labeled as a 7 since you have that 1, 3, 5 and your 7. So the only difference between a root position triad, which is labeled with nothing, and the 7th chord is that you have that 7th added on top of it. And now a first inversion 7th chord is going to be labeled with a 5 and a 6. And this is all because instead of having a 1, 3, 5, and 7, now you have a 1, 3, 5, and 6. And you can't just call it a 6 because that is a first inversion triad. Because if you remembered, I said that also having a 6 below the note in figured bass for triads is another way of saying to not play the 5th. So when you put that 5-6, you're reinforcing the fact that this is a 7th chord because you're playing the 5 and the 6. Okay, so first inversion is 5-6. Okay, now second inversion is 3-4. This makes sense because remember, in your second inversion, you have that second in the middle there. So you have a 1, 3, 4, and then 6. So instead of writing 3, 4, and 6, the 6 is already going to be assumed when we're writing a 3-4. You're not going to have a triad that has a 3rd and a 4th in it. That's only going to occur in a 7th chord. So 3-4 is describing the fact that this is a 7th chord and you have a 1, 3, 4, and 6. The 6 is assumed. Next we move on to third inversion, which is notated as 2 and 4. And this makes perfect sense because if you look at your third inversion, you have a 1, 2, 4, and 6. So again, your 6 is assumed because we know that there's no triad that will have a 2nd and 4th in it. That's only going to occur in a third inversion 7th chord. So that 2-4 is just telling us to play that third inversion. So we have a 1, 2, 4, and 6. The 6 again is assumed. Now let's just kind of talk about the position of C here. I did kind of talk about this in my triad video, but it'd probably be good to talk about this again. So as you can see, my root position, my C is my first note. And as you can see in my first inversion, my C is my last note. But in figured bass, it's still going to be written as a C 5-6 because that's telling me a first inversion C major 7 chord. And just to quickly describe why I know it's a C major 7, well, I know C, E, G, and B is a major 7. And as you can see on the staff here, there are no sharps or flats written anywhere here. So when this is telling you to build that 7th chord, it's telling you to build a 1, 3, 5, and 7. And if you do that, you have the notes C, E, G, and B, which I know is a C major 7th chord. And again, that's all because there's no sharp or flat here. Okay, so now my second inversion, you can see my C is my third note. But again, that is the nature of a second inversion 7th chord. And my third inversion 7th chord, you can see my C is that second note there. So what I'm explaining here is, let's look at the third inversion here. It's not telling you to play a 1, 2, 4, and 6 from the note C. It's telling you to play a third inversion of that C note because you have that 2 in your 4, which is communicating with you that that is a third inversion. So we see the note C, but we know it's a third inversion, which is a 1, 2, 4, and 6. So figured bass is almost like telling you where this note is going to be positioned in your chord. So figured bass is not really used in today's current day and age, but if you are studying music and want to know about music history, it is something important to know because in the Baroque and classical era, they did use figured bass a lot. So from like the 1600s to the middle of the 1700s, they were using figured bass a lot. And they would use figured bass a lot of times in the context of something called a basso continuo. So basically a basso continuo is going to have a line of music written, just one line, and it's going to have figured bass written below that. And the person playing and reading the music is going to be improvising, and they're going to be filling in the rest of the notes for the chords by looking at that figured bass. So it's good to understand this because maybe some original pieces of music you might be interested in studying might be written with figured bass. So then you could take that original piece and interpret it, try to make sense with it, compare how other people interpret it, see if you maybe agree with their interpretations. So that's it for this video, Inversions for 7th chords. If you like this video, give this video a thumbs up. If you want to see more of these videos, subscribe. I'm going to be posting a video like this at least once a week, and it will slowly but surely build your understanding of music and music composition. Then after a while, you'll be able to create your own music. So thank you very much for watching. Have a good day.